We're kicking off the final segment of our day, which should be a really interesting one, and it focuses all around technology and AI and innovation and how is machine learning applicable to compliance and ethics and so on and so forth. You probably see here, I did want to mention, so this is a topic that we've been hearing a lot about for about 2 years. I keep mentioning Bella, so you'll have to forgive me, but the conversations in Bella are, what are other companies doing related to AI and ethics in AI, and how do we get in front of some of the pace of change? When you talk about banks and financial services, all the way to, I don't know if Tom from Bayer is here, maybe in the back, I know Microsoft, GE, a lot of companies are really kind of trying to grapple with this. And so we said we don't really have the answers right now, but what we'll do is we'll start a conversation. We'll bring together a lot of leaders who care about this, who are building homegrown tools, so on and so forth, and we'll host a program, and that will be a Bella initiative that carries on for 12 to 24 months in a variety of ways. So this takes place in California, which is very far from London, but we did want to mention this. It should be a really good one. LinkedIn is going to host it. We'll have about 90 pretty senior leaders who are all going to try wrapping their head around what do we need to be aware of. So that's the plug for that. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Emily.
Well, welcome back. My name is Emily Rickaby. I'm the Global Resources Manager for Bella at Ethisphere. And I am really honored to be sitting here with yet another panel of outstanding speakers to talk about ethics in the digital evolution. What are the ethical standards? Should we have them related to AI and machine learning? And start to explore that conversation. So certainly I am not the expert here, but like all of us here, I'm human, and I can be the beneficiary of all this new technology, or maybe a potential victim of this new technology. So we're just going to get the conversation started, as Stefan mentioned. We're not expecting the panelists here to have all the answers for you. We're just starting the discussion, and we invite you to join us as well as we go through the conversation. So most organizations are employing, to some degree, some level of AI or machine learning technology in their products, services, or even internally within their operations. And there's a lot of benefits to that, right? We get efficiencies. Machines are much faster than we are. We get new insights. Machines can plow through huge volumes of data and make connections that we would never be able to do. But the deployment of these technologies is certainly outpacing the creation of any ethical standards about their development and use. And there's concerns, right? An area of concern is bias and discrimination, right? The machines are picking up our bad habits, or maybe creating some of their own. And of course, there's also issues surrounding data privacy and data security. So if we're going to have some sort of ethical standards, ethical framework for this type of technology, where should that come from? Should it come from the tech development companies themselves? Should it come from government regulations, professional organizations like we have in this room? So those are some of the questions we're going to get at today. So as a way to get the conversation started, I'm going to have each panelist introduce themselves, a little bit about their role, and then tell us what they've been seeing in terms of AI and machine learning within their own organizations. What are the conversations that they're having? We'll start with Julia.
And then I test the mic. Hello, everyone. I'm Julia McCraw. I am the Global Head of Privacy Compliance at Standard Chartered Bank. Standard Chartered Bank is an emerging markets bank. We're present in over 60 countries, but mostly in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So we have a very limited presence in Europe. You won't have seen us on the high streets in Europe because we're just not here. And we are using AI, but in a very nascent, early stages at the moment. At the moment, our definition of AI is really not artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. And most of it's very human-led. And we're also using it primarily in our back office operations. So to the points you raised, a lot of it is around efficiency and risk identification. So picking up on one of the earlier conversations around anti-bribery. So if we're looking at our financial crime compliance obligations and anti-money laundering, we're obliged to screen all transactions that we process. That runs into the billions every day. And that's done automatically, and we're using AI to get better at flushing out alerts. We'll see something that looks anomalous and have to review it to determine if it's we might have suspicions of money laundering around it. And before, that was a human doing it, and a human had to make a decision within 2 seconds as to whether or not it looked anomalous, and then it would go up a kind of escalation chain. We're now using AI to look at that far more quickly, in the role of the human instead. We used to get, I suppose, lost the wood for the trees. We'd be looking at so many in such high volume, whereas now the human can focus on the higher, more complex cases, the higher value add stuff, and really focus our attention. So we're getting better at identifying financial crime risks, so potential evasion of economic sanctions, potential fraud against our clients, and that kind of area. We also look at it, use AI a bit in credit limit monitoring, but it's back office mostly. And as I say, it's very early stages. We talked about, which area of the organisation and what the conversations are at the moment. So obviously I'm from compliance, regulatory compliance. It was great hearing about some of the other compliance teams here. Our compliance function, I think, amounts to about 2,000 people in total, if you include lots of different teams across the world. But we're just one element of the teams looking at the use of AI. We've also got our Chief Data Officer, our Information Security Officer, and so there's a few of us coming at it through different lenses, and so it's fitting into different frameworks already. So it's covered by lots of different parts of the bank, and AI is being deployed in different areas of the bank. But as I say, it's still very early. So when you started this by saying you're getting the experts, we all looked at each other and said, so, yeah.
Well, really, as expert as I think a lot of us feel, right? And so that's part of the shared pain and the shared journey that we're all on. So thanks. Sebastian?
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Sebastian Scheid. I'm working with compliance at Deutsche Telekom for 8 years now, and since 2 years I am the compliance officer of the so-called operative segment Germany. That means all the business Deutsche Telekom is doing in Germany. And on top of that, I'm responsible for the case management and the compliance check kind of audits and some other tasks. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. I like to do some sports, riding my motorbike, spending time with my 3 kids. 2 of them already adults, but still on my account. As you ask us about conversation we have on AI within our company, I nevertheless would like to start with a conversation on AI I had outside the company. Yesterday evening, my wife and me, we went to bed, and she asked me where I'm going to tomorrow, where I'm being today, right? And I told her, oh, I'm going to a big conference and being on the panel with fantastic people and talking on AI and ethics on AI and what we call digital ethics and so on and so on. And I was expecting that she would reply something like, oh, that's a great topic and I'm proud of you and all this kind of stuff a man loves to hear, right? But what she replied was, digital ethics. Nobody needs that. I said, what? Why? And she said, because we should not make machines that intelligent that we really need digital ethics. We should not make machines that intelligent because, or only because we can. We should not have real autonomous AI. That wouldn't be a good deal for mankind. To be honest, I could follow a little bit her arguments. Nevertheless, I have a slightly different opinion on that. And unfortunately, and it was my mistake, I told her that, which destroyed my plans of getting a sleep fast and easy. So this is one, let's say, view on that. But we have AI. We also have it at Deutsche Telekom. We use it in chatbots. We use it in network planning and all that kind of stuff. And I would say the most important ethical challenge is the development of AI, at least autonomous AI, which we do not have today. So we have some time for that, which perfectly fits to us humans and which is human-centric and value-oriented to prevent the risk of discriminating, the risk of intransparent decisions made by AI, and to keep the autonomy of human beings. So, and this is what we had in mind when we started at Deutsche Telekom the initiative which we call Digital Ethics. And the first result of that was that we had 9 guidelines which we published on ethical AI, which we said these are our guidelines as Deutsche Telekoms. And we did that to ensure a trustworthy AI. Not only because we love that as we are a compliance department, but we did that on a broad basis, involving IT, technology, sales, procurement, you name it. And we are really convinced that we need digital ethics to generate sustainable success for DT with AI, and that you cannot buy ethics. You need to do it by yourself. Right? You need to do it on an individual basis for your own company. And what we reached so far, but I will not go into so much details because there are a lot of more questions. We have these guidelines. We started to implement them. Yeah, to have guidelines is a starting basis. It's good, but it's not the end. We integrated it also into our supplier code of conduct, and we started a discussion as far as we can. So externally, in the public, we opened a digital ethics center to have discussions with the society and to start this discussion. What does ethic mean, and what are the values we would like to implement into AI? So it's a lot of conversation at DT recently.
I know I'm not the person asking the questions, but these 9 guidelines, they apply within Deutsche Telekom, or you're applying them externally as well? Is it how did you choose 9? Is it by reference to your business lines, or?
Okay. So the number 9, I think we got it by accident. It's just that we had heavily discussions on what does ethics mean, and we came up to this 9 guidelines, and they are a framework for us, for DT internally, but we also published them externally to give a promise to our customer, to our stake and shareholders.
Thank you. Pete, let's hear from your perspective.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Pete Davies. I'm a senior manager at EY. I'm also an engineer rather than a lawyer or an accountant. I guess there are 2 strings to my bow. One is around analytics, and by that I mean statistics, and then the other one is around automation. And it's arguable that statistics plus automation is the modern definition of AI in a practical sense that's being used in industries. It's, they are machines that are looking at numbers, finding patterns or trying to match patterns, because intelligence is pattern matching, arguably. And doing it in an automated manner, which makes it faster than humans applying that manually. So my background was in manufacturing, industrial automation and improvement, then moving into banking, financial services, particularly around IT and cost control, and a lot of the compliance work around invoicing and spend control. And then in telecoms, looking at network design, and again in supplier control and compliance around that kind of field. So, I mean, from the EY perspective and the kind of work that me and my team do, there are 2 strands to this. We use AI to do compliance, so we use AI to detect patterns in transactions, to look at network analysis between individuals, to categorize. Basically, we're in the business of finding needles in haystacks. The data is proliferating, exactly as Michael said earlier on. There's so much data now. How do you deal with that? From a data analytics person, that's great, because there's more stuff, there's more raw material, there's more trends and things we can link and infer. The second side of things is you're doing compliance for AI. At the moment in our team, this is generally around looking at algorithms that are being used to make decisions. So we do a lot of work in investigations and disputes. when an algorithm has been applied by, let's say, a funding body that's allocating funding for research or for academia or something like that, and somebody wants to complain about that and protest a decision that the computer has made, then we would look into that and help them to understand what's gone on and who was in the right and whether that decision was correct. As AI gets more complicated, that will be a more data-heavy lifting problem. And interestingly, I mean, as AI techniques continue, it is possible that the truth of what actually happened is beyond basic accountancy and reconciliation. If anybody's a mathematician and wants something interesting, or is a compliance officer and wants to scare, Google how machines learn, and there's a great video that explains how genetic algorithms are beyond even their designers of understanding what they actually do and how they work. So that's what we do, not to scare anybody.
Excellent, and I think that's a great lead-in to our next topic. When we were discussing earlier, I think I had originally framed it as the risks or the liability associated, right, with these machine learning and AI technologies. But I love the way that Sebastian put it, which is it's really about accountability, right? So whose fault is it when AI goes awry? Where does responsibility sit? How do we define accountability?
Yeah, maybe this is one of the questions we cannot, or we might not answer completely today, but when you're asking what to do when AI goes awry, we all should run as fast as we can. But so I'm not a lawyer, but coming from a legal view, my strong belief is that the human always remains responsible. We should always put always the humans first. And looking more to laws and something like that, I think product liability, consumer protection, etc., it's still valid, right? Using AI or not. But of course, for real autonomous AI, it will be difficult to understand where and in what constellation a fault occurs, right? And then who is accountable. That means, and I think you mentioned it also, the challenge is to install the right control points and doing that as continuous quality assurance for AI. We do not have that yet. We do not have that yet. Another point is at least from my point of view, that we should avoid overregulation, right? So fearing AI and doing some regulation and more and more and more, and just to try to feel safe. I think we should differentiate, like we're doing in compliance always. We should do it risk-oriented, because an AI which suggests us the favorite music titles is a completely other thing than an AI in autonomous driving vehicles or at medical treatments or whatever. And coming from an internal view, from DT, we said, and we defined that in our guidelines, it's one of our guidelines, we said we are responsible. We are always responsible. That means we know exactly who, that means one woman or one man, who is responsible for a certain AI system. That seems or sounds like a no-brainer maybe, but we had an example in Germany. There was an airline, Air Berlin, and it went bankrupt. But at the point in time when Air Berlin went bankrupt, the prices for Lufthansa flights in Germany went up significantly. And it was really significant, so that the regulator asked Lufthansa, hey, what are you doing? And the first answer was, according to the newspaper at least, the first answer was, from Lufthansa, the price finding was done by algorithms. Say what? Okay. Some independent algorithms? Who owes this algorithm? So we do not want to give such an answer as Deutsche Telekom, but we say we are responsible for that, and that means we have to take care about our AI and what it is doing.
It was interesting how you interpreted the question, because when you talked about it's always the human that remains accountable, and I'd actually drilled it down to the next point that you talked about, I suppose, accountability within an organisation. And so we already have various accountability frameworks across the bank, whether it's part of our conduct risk management framework or our senior manager regime stuff. But we need to drill down to who is the man or the woman that owns the application, that owns the decisions. So perhaps the scary videos of how do machines learn, there should always be one person who does understand, how the secret sauce is made. And we find that hard because we find accountabilities for most of our activities quite difficult to narrow down, being very honest. And so that is something that we'll just use existing frameworks. So you previously asked about, are there other frameworks that we can leverage to govern AI? Yes, we definitely use compliance frameworks, operational risk frameworks, and it's a kind of a mishmash of them. And we're currently thinking, do we need to create an entirely separate framework for AI and ethics, or does it remain sort of part of a puzzle that's governed by other frameworks? And then you also talked about don't over-regulate, and we couldn't agree with you more. But at the same time, we welcome guidelines because there are, and I think you might want to touch on it later, some contradictions in the mixed messages as what we're getting. And so some guidelines, some clarity is helpful, and it also helps set a level playing field as well, because if we, as a bank, being judged against, fintech firms or against the Googles, the Apple Pays, how are we being assessed against them? And then going back to your initial point that ethics starts with us, within our own bank, and so we need to decide what principles we adhere to, and therefore how that translates to accountability within the bank. So it's a kind of, we're thinking about it, it's not entirely clear yet, but you're right, I think it needs to drill down to an individual who would take responsibility for something.
I mean, the customer's perception is always going to hold the brand responsible.
Yeah.
I think that's the challenge. So Lufthansa was the brand that was being held responsible there. I mean, often when new technology is deployed in this way, it doesn't make sense for a large company to develop that in-house, and it has to rely on suppliers to bring that in. The understanding of the technology, particularly when it's an advanced technology like that, there's certainly an asymmetry between the buyer and the seller of the understanding of that. In that situation, the seller contractually will generally protect themselves rather well to any fallout or problems that come from that. And I think that buyers and organizations that are investing in this technology need to be very careful of the unintended consequences and ensuring that somebody has some understanding in their organization, at least at a high level, and is at least thinking about a framework of risks and things that come on. For example, an airline pricing model that is told to optimize for the best pricing of the market conditions will always do that. You need to build in something that says, but not if that's at the cost of a competitor that's just gone bust. So that kind of framework to come in. And that's where I think that regulation can help to a certain extent. In a free market, these mistakes will be made and people will learn by violence. But then regulation can put in place frameworks and impose standards and say, here are the list of things you need to make sure that your pricing algorithm doesn't do. Here's the things you need to make sure that your customer service algorithm is considerate of and steers clear of, for example, these protected categories when regards discrimination and things like that. If those things aren't put in place, it becomes very rapidly a Wild West where brands disappear overnight and the Twitter storms spin up very quickly, and people learn the hard way.
Well, let's jump into a little bit of our conversation on the regulatory standpoint. And I think that gets into also conversations about level of transparency, with what's taking place and who's making the decisions, how are the decisions made. So it's sort of expectations versus the practicalities, right, of the technology itself. And I think I'll start with Julia here. We talked a little bit about how sometimes from a regulatory standpoint, there's conflicts, right, between what the regulation would like to see and then the realities of the technologies and what you can provide to say that we're meeting the regulations.
Yes, there are sort of inconsistencies, and it's interesting actually looking at, sorry Pete to exclude you on this, but we're both from very heavily regulated industries, and I wonder if you'd ask sort of questions to some of the panellists that have appeared in other discussions, what their answers would be like.
We have regulators too.
Yeah, good point. Not as harsh as ours. Yeah, so we find we're actually engaging in some regulatory advocacy around the use of AI, and because we find that regulators, like us, we're not entirely sure we understand it, and I suppose that's where some of the fear of AI comes from, is it's because that potential lack of transparency. But then, do we always understand everything we make decisions about? Arguably no. But the conversation we're having with regulators is they seem to expect a much lower or a higher level of accuracy from anything that we use AI with. So back to my example, I'm ex-financial crime compliance, so I always use those as examples. But if it was a human conducting those reviews I mentioned earlier, there's a degree of regulatory tolerance for error. Their tolerance is zero error if you use a machine. So, and yet the machine, by definition, is learning. It will make mistakes as it develops. And so how do we reconcile those kind of standards with the regulator saying zero tolerance for error and us saying, well, this is a nascent thing we're learning? And that's where things like regulatory sandboxes are helpful, because you get a sort of safe space to play in. And then you've got things like the GDPR, the four-letter word, talking about driving greater accountability, where nobody quite knows how that's going to manifest itself in the practice of deployment of AI. And you even have the FCA and the PRA here having to lead international work streams into basically defining what they mean and what they're going to be looking for. So it's definitely, I think we're all learning, we're all trying to work out, what's the pathway through this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, the GDPR is a very interesting bit of regulation, particularly the bit about explaining how decisions are made. I mean, it could be extended to look at, if you look at firms that are at the cutting edge of this kind of inferential technology. So why was I served all these ads on my webpage? It's not because of the kind of technology that's used and the amount of data that's been gathered to build that picture. In order to comply to the letter of GDPR, you'd have to provide all that information about the data subject individual, but also about everybody else in the entire population that's been used to build the inferential model that says that they're interested in adverts for those particular trainers. Yeah, and that's basically, you need to download the internet to meet every
I read it yesterday, the whole internet.
Got to the end, yeah. So yeah, I completely agree that there's potentially a bit of a gap between the practicalities of what regulation requires and what is kind of meant by the spirit. The spirit is much more about, tell us why you behaved in this way with this customer and this way with this customer, because we think you disadvantage somebody in this kind of environment. So that's where the human's got to kind of provide some oversight and make sure that the machines are behaving themselves.
So just another sentence on that. Maybe you ask if there's, let's say, a conflict between regulation and reality. Of course, right? It's natural to have that, but we already know that it's not AI dependent. So from a compliance perspective, think about having a needed investigation versus data privacy, right? So you always have, often case-by-case basis, decide what is the higher good on this special case. But I would like to turn it maybe, or the view on that, maybe a little bit, and saying, let's not think about what could be the conflict between the expectations of regulation, like GDPR, and reality of AI, but maybe let's ask, what could we do to lead AI and to realize the opportunities which AI is promising to us? And that in a way that leads to a result which really fits, and I'm repeating now myself, but really fits to the human values. Yeah, so to find a way to the future and having or use this big and fantastic, maybe fantastic abilities of AI.
So in addition to maybe what the regulators might expect, what about consumers, customers, the lay people out there in terms of what level of transparency is owed to them? And how do you communicate that to your stakeholders in terms of the developments that you're deploying in your organizations? Can just be thoughts, doesn't have to be answers. We're just talking here, right?
Sure. So it's interesting when you start to talk about ethics and AI, the conversation, particularly in the minds of consumers, very quickly goes to the very complicated ethical question, the trolley problem, who does the self-driving car save and who do they run over and that kind of thing. A lot of the challenges that we are working with clients on are much more at the kind of baby steps stage of AI implementation. How to avoid, the case study is Target in the US that had a kind of inferential model deciding what what flyers and promotions to send out to its customers based on its customer card. One gentleman was very annoyed to receive a whole load of pregnancy-related flyers and materials. It only later transpired when he complained to the store and found out that it was because his daughter had been using his card, and that's how he found out he was going to become a grandfather. And that wasn't ideal in his book, right? So there's a simple question there about, had the people who designed that program considered other people using the store card rather than the person they intend and have on the address database? Is it right that certain categories of products should be sent through the mail on promotions? Might discretion be important to their customers and ethical in many situations? So it's not looking at the big human condition questions that we're helping with. It's more around the identify the risks and look for the laws of unintended consequences, as with any kind of automated system that's contacting a customer. Something that cuts a phone off after 30 days of not being used might need some controls to make sure that that line's not being used for something important that happens every 2 months. Yeah. Things like that.
So to answer that question from another perspective, maybe, we are deeply convinced that we need our customers' trust. And to have or to keep that trust, I think transparency is highly needed. That means we decided for ourselves to always make very clear where we use AI, not only, but in particular when impacting health, safety, financial well-being, of course, but also in chatbots, just talking about tariffs, new mobile handsets, and whatsoever. And I think we always have to make clear to what extent we as a company can explain what the AI is doing and where we cannot. Saying, okay, this part is a black box, maybe. And unless there's no real proof that, for example, neural networks, which can't be controlled today, right? Unless we have no proof that they can be controlled, we should give our customers or the people the decision if they would like to use this AI in this specific use case. And as I said, humans must be kept self-determined, and this is one step toward that.
And I think perhaps we might be picking up on what you're both saying is reading too much into what we think consumers want. So, from my own perspective, I think a privacy notice or a fair processing notice that says, we've picked up these data fields from you, we're going to use it, we're going to combine it with this in order to sort of interpret how we advertise to you, but also how we recommend certain other things to you. We're also going to do it to find out where you are or whatever. If somebody's telling me that level, then I feel, okay, they are being transparent with me. I'm not looking for them to give me a sort of page-long sheet of coding or something that would explain it. And it goes back to a similar concept of consent. How do people give consent if they're not fully aware of what's going on? Well, it's if you can't really explain the ultimate vision or objective of what you're doing, then I'm not sure why you're doing it. That's really all I think we're really currently being compelled to explain is, well, we're taking this type of data or whatever from you in order to achieve such and such, then I would hope that would address the majority of concerns.
I think a lot of what we're hearing too is the words humanity, human values, wanting to maintain that, wanting to always have some human foothold, if you will, within the machinery. But what do we mean when we say human values, right? What are those? And how do we choose, right? How do we choose what's priority in terms of human values? And when we were talking earlier, Pete, you brought up an interesting issue in that sometimes these technologies have exposed certain truths about us as humans that maybe we don't want to know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the particular example I'm talking about there is some analysis done by the US Department of Justice. They were looking at bias in judges and whether the sentencing decisions and the decision to kind of permit bail or were they looking at reoffending rates, and was that helping, and were humans making good decisions really on a fairly wide basis? When they provided a whole load of data on the criminals involved, I'm not sure of the privacy angles. I think when you're a criminal in the US, then lots of your rights disappear pretty quickly. But when they looked at all the factors and they ran the numbers on it, and they looked at things like the nature of the crime, the number of offences, the kind of history in the correctional system, they found that the thing that was the biggest, best indicator of whether they were going to reoffend or not was their zip code, their postcode, where they live. And this was way better than letting a 60-year-old judge or older make a decision based on his wealth of experience, because his biases and the variety, the consistency between judges was so low that postcode was way better. Now, the problem that broke down here is that people don't like their chances of being incarcerated being based on their neighbours and how they've behaved in the past. So the project kind of ended there, and they went back to the crusty old judges because that was preferable. That was the way it always kind of had been. So I think that the key question here is that it's not so much the AI, but the maths exposes certain truths and certain correlations and certain drivers that, if allowed to drive the decisions, will lead to behaviours that are fairly unpalatable. Kind of a Minority Report kind of pre-crime situation where, statistically guilty until until incarcerated, really. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, maybe I can add another question, another example on that. In Germany, we have roughly 3,500 people killed by traffic accidents per year. So it's bad, but it's a number. And just think about, or imagine using autonomous driving vehicles. Just a thought experiment, right? Maybe you could reduce this from 3,500 to 2,500. Would be a good thing, right? But what would you think if 500 of this 2,500 would be killed by failures done by the self-driving cars? Would we wish for that as well? Not that easy to answer, right? So it's a little bit like we expect failures from human beings, but when we talk about machines, we would like to have zero tolerance, zero failure, and this is not realistic, I would say. So.
And it's a bit like our chief data officer. Pete talked about bias. Our chief data officer, whenever he talks about AI and ethics and the fact that people seek decisions that are entirely unbiased. He says, okay, first person in the room who thinks they're unbiased to put their hand up, gets a prize. And nobody ever puts their hand up. So, is that, again, an unrealistic or an inappropriate expectation to impose on the use of AI? And we seem to distinguish between the concept of data ethics and general ethics, and why. Why are they different? And is it just back to your original question, Emily, well, what are these values that we're imposing? Are they sort of inherent in each of our organisations and relating to the characters and the sort of cultures of our own organisation? So it's not, you can't prescribe it universally. We've each got our own character, I suppose, to impose on our use of AI. And it's communicating that so consumers then have a choice. I like the culture of this place, but I don't like the culture of that, so I'll stick with that one.
I think as every kind of beginner programmer knows, computers do exactly what you tell them to do, not what you want them to do. And
that sounds like my toddler.
There are similarities bringing up a toddler and trying to persuade them of what they want to do. Yeah. But I think that the kind of key thing here is once the parameters are defined and you can tell the intelligent system or the system that is simulating intelligence what is wanted in all circumstances, and that's a very difficult ask because of all the sense, and the humans are slower and they make mistakes, but they have common sense, and we've yet to see that on a disk that we can put somewhere.
And actually talking to my colleagues before this session about what we mean by ethics, and most of them said we mean common sense.
Yeah. So the way that we meet that challenge when using AI and deploying it in some very high profile and very important investigations is that the AI will be used as a filter. We'll find the needle in the haystack. Whether that actually is a needle and isn't the needle you want, and where did all these needles come from anyway, is a human responsibility. And by taking that human out of the mechanical machine processing of going through all the files, identifying all the expense reports, building the networks of who's talking to who and who's getting invited to which parties, then you can start to add more value. You can start to remove those false positives and those errors that the machine is throwing up because it's always going to have an error rate, and do things that you could never do if you were just a human on your own because you've been assisted by the AI.
I know we're getting a little short of time, but I do want to open it up. So if we can broaden this conversation right in this room, if there's a question or two or a comment or two from the audience.
My name is Mahi. I work for Aptiv, which is previously Delphi Automotive, and we are exactly in the space of autonomous driving. And it is very interesting to hear the panelists discuss the various scenarios and the extreme situations. And I think the business that we are in, we are actually at the forefront where it's still a very, very open landscape. There is literally very little regulation around it, and the technology is moving at a phenomenal pace compared to regulation. And when you talk about ethics around surrounding autonomous driving, even common sense actually sometimes may not really fix that gap. And it will then come down to the regulators and the companies and forums and boards and associations to decide for the entire generation what they think is right. For example, like a machine, if it's faced with a biker coming too close or an old lady with a baby on a pram, the car is going to decide based on who it's most likely to survive. And you may not always like that result, but that's the machine, and you put that intelligence in, you put that pattern testing in, and it is and it's different, and it's still common sense, because it's still common sense to save the person who's most likely to survive the accident. But then your common sense itself then fights you to tell you, well, you should have tried the other option. And so I think it then comes down to regulation today. And today, today we are still technologically in a place where you don't have level 4, which is like a fully autonomous car driving on the road, is still in test conditions. But there are hundreds of cars that my own company actually has on the roads, which are semi-automatic. That is, you still have a driver, but it's fully autonomous, but you still have a driver present there. And I would actually encourage, if anybody is actually in Las Vegas, you can use the Lyft app and select one of those autonomous vehicles to ride along the Las Vegas stretch if you want to try it out. It is an interesting experience. But our test results have shown 99.9% of accuracy. But you still have, like you said, the 1 or 2 instances where the Uber driver crashed into a lady and they died, or a Tesla car having a crash, and a whole generation makes a decision based on 1 or 2 instances. And like you rightly pointed out, we are happy have 3,000 human errors, but not ready for 500 machine errors. So it's I think it's a very interesting landscape that we are in, and we are looking forward actually to see how this is going to develop. And we are working very actively with many regulators around the world to actually see how this regulation is going to be put into place. Yeah. And there is no uniformity in how governments are responding, especially in the US. Different states respond in different ways. Some states are very open to us to test the cars in their cities, and some are completely saying, no way, you can't do this.
It's not my domain, but I'm going to say it anyway. Terrible biased plug, but there's a very good website called Driverless Guru, which synthesizes all these discussions, and it would say actually those 1 or 2 errors were all human errors, where human overrided the machine decision. But full disclosure, my husband runs that website, but it's driverlessguru.com.
Excellent. Well, certainly, we're putting our toes in the water here on this conversation, and I'd like to thank our panelists for sort of starting us off on this journey, and invite all of you to continue discussing this as we go forward. So, thank you.